This podcast is sponsored by Adelaide. You've probably heard of Adelaide by now. This month, they announced a new product, Adelaide for Publishers. For the first time, publishers can leverage attention metrics to curate inventory, deliver attention insights, and drive higher CPMs. Join the Weather Company, NPR, Westwood One, Cumulus Media, and other leading publishers taking advantage of the attention economy's most popular metric, AU. Maybe one day Mark will convince me to sell guaranteed AU slots on Marketecture, but probably not. Check out adelaidemetrics.com/AFP for more information. Welcome to the Marketecture Podcast. This is Ari Paparo. I'm joined today by Eric Franchi and Chris Kane. Chris Kane has been here before. You're our first repeat guest. You're actually a three-time guest now. It's like Saturday Night Live when they bring Steve Martin on.
It's good to be here. It's good to be back.
Eric and I are at Possible, the conference down in Miami. We're having a fun time. And we have the same special content that we had last year, which is what we call People on the Street, where we give very quick interviews to folks who we meet here at Possible. And that's going to come later in the show. So please stay tuned to hear from some leaders in the ad tech world. So Eric, how's the show been for you?
I mean, it has been awesome. Last year was the first year. It was, I think, very, very promising. They had, some like unforgettable moments with, namely Elon and Linda on the stage. I think it set the stage well for this year. But I am just like blown away by the attendance. Like there's just so many people here. People are hanging out, and there's a ton of meetings happening. There's a ton of sponsors. Like there's been more than one person that has sort of said, "Hey, why do we go halfway around the world to France to basically do what we're doing now?" Which I think is interesting, but also sort of kind of maybe doesn't cover the entire global perspective. But it's been great. What about you, Art?
Yeah, I totally reiterate what you're saying. Gary Vee was the keynote. He did a great job. It was really interesting. Some people hate Gary Vee. Some people love him. Whatever. He's interesting no matter what. The overwhelming conversation I've been having with folks in the industry is, does this replace something? Where's the budget coming from? Where's the time coming from? Is it CES or is it Cannes or is it something else? I think it's an interesting business problem for CMOs in our business and marketers to figure out if it's worth dropping 50, 100 grand on this event. Versus, having a presence at some of those other events. I think people definitely like the weather better here, though.
Chris, you got to come out next year.
The other thing I've learned pretty clearly is that this podcast is pretty popular. My God, the number of people who've come up to me like I'm some sort of celebrity and are like, "Oh my God, I had a woman I don't even know take a selfie with me."
Wait, what happened?
A little strange.
What happened?
It was at your party. So I was meeting someone who I didn't really know very well, but I was being introduced to this person. And they were asking what I'm doing. And I said, well, I have a podcast. And they looked at me like people normally do, like I'm a loser. And then I literally said, it's kind of popular, actually. And at that very moment, I said, it's kind of popular. Some woman I've never seen before interrupts, like gives me a hug and takes a selfie with me.
You are a celebrity.
I am. I also have a tip because the number of people who come up to me and said some variation of like, oh man, I'd really love to be on your podcast. How do I qualify? Like, what is the criteria? Step one, send me an email. This is not very difficult. If you're listening to this podcast and you have some burning desire to speak your truth to our audience, send me an email. I may say no. I may not respond. But if you don't send me an email, you're not putting your best foot forward.
Great tip.
All right. Enough of my ego trip. Let's talk about the real stuff. All right. So, Chris, why do we have you here on the pod for the third time?
I don't know. You guys keep inviting me back, and I keep saying yes.
Okay.
No, there's a reason.
Enough.
There's a reason.
So I run Jounce Media. We're a research business. We publish monthly reports that go deep on ad tech details, and then an annual report that sort of talks about the big picture of what are the needle moving business forces in the industry. We call it the state of the open internet. And so we publish it each year in April. It went out to our subscribers earlier this week. I shared a copy with you guys. I said you asked me back. I actually asked to have an opportunity to come back. I emailed Ari. It worked. And so, yeah, we can talk about the report and sort of some big picture takes on what's happening in the industry.
Yeah, so the report's amazing. It's just packed full of interesting insights and trends. I'm going to kind of ask you about some of the ones I thought were interesting. To start with a bang, and this is a direct quote from your report, open internet demand is shifting away from incumbents like Google and Meta towards ad tech platforms. That was interesting.
Yeah, it's I think you can interpret this positively or negatively, but just like as a starting point on the facts, Google's open internet business declined. They spent less money on the open internet in 2023 than they did in 2022. That just seems like a very big deal. During that same time period, pure play ad tech companies grew. Trade Desk grew by more than 20%. I mean, it's just like this is a very consequential share shift. I interpret it as a very positive sign that advertisers are really voting with their wallets and are moving budgets to platforms that they trust to deploy their investments in responsible ways. I think also from the sell side of the market, it speaks to the mix shift of where open internet media companies are getting their revenue. And Google by far is still the largest source of revenue for open internet media companies, but it's smaller than it used to be.
When I read it, I want to make sure I'm interpreting this correctly. In that, a lot of the demand shift has gone to Amazon and Walmart. So they're like two of the largest non-Google demand sources on the open web. So is this positive or negative in that if retail media networks are now some of the largest demand sources for publishers on the web? Does this mean it's positive because it's not the walled gardens of the past? Or is it negative in that these are the walled gardens of the future and publishers are going to get a smaller slice of the pie because, these are going to be powerful and where a lot of budgets are going to eat up just because of the nature of RMNs and, how performance centric they are?
I mean, I think you framed up both sides of it well. And those, that's the tension here. I think generally speaking, publishers want revenue diversification and they're not getting it. The natural trend of the industry is that buyers choose to buy through the biggest platforms, and they should. That's the right choice for buyers. The biggest platforms can make fixed cost investments in product capabilities, service levels, listening to the entire bid stream that make them structurally better at serving advertisers than subscale bidding platforms. And so the buy side very rationally concentrates its investment with a small number of platforms. Now, those platforms are changing. Yes, there's money moving toward Amazon DSP, but I think the structural issue for publishers is revenue concentration. And I don't see that going away at all. I think the other thing that falls out of this, which I think is sort of the most important sort of like operational fallout of buyer decisions to concentrate their investments, is that the auction that really matters is the auction that happens inside the DSP. You send a bid request to Amazon DSP and you get back a response. Inside Amazon DSP, they're evaluating hundreds of thousands of advertisers that might want to bid. But SSPs are not selling their inventory to this sort of like hyper fragmented set of buyers. They're selling to 3 to maybe 10 DSPs. And so that's why auction density is so thin. And that's why publishers work so hard to sort of like get multiple bids out of each DSP.
Right. I think it's also important to realize the statement here is that the open platforms are gaining share in the open web. That doesn't mean that they're gaining share in the advertising world. If you look at usually the reports are all about how the walled gardens are continuing to grow at the expense of open in the entire pie. And that's not necessarily something you're disputing here.
No, that is very much the case. In the last 7 years, non-search digital advertising has tripled. 100% of that growth has gone to the walled gardens. The open internet is flat. I mean, you can squint at a chart and be like, oh, it's a little uptick, 2% year over year growth, but this is a flat category. Like that or not, the math says this is a flat category. And so we're really talking about share shift within a low growth category.
It's worth noting, just a side note, that there's been a bunch of chatter on Reddit and elsewhere that AdSense revenue has been really impacted this year. And it seems very inconclusive, so I'm not going to draw our attention to it. But if anyone knows anything about that.
One of the things that we wrestled with in writing the report, you just have to make some assumptions, is we know for sure based on public filings that Google's open internet business is down year over year. What we don't know is how does that look if you decompose it into DV360 versus Google Ads? And I have no idea what the answer is, but my hunch is that the change, either the growth or the decline is not consistent across those two business lines.
Let's talk about MFA, our favorite subject here, made for advertising. You did a great job talking about MFA last time you were here. But in particular, your report claims that there's been a collapse in MFA in 2023, effectively from when the last ANA report came out, and that it's gone from about 30% of impressions to less than 15 in the last 9 months. Can you talk us through what's going on there?
So I mentioned we write these monthly reports that go deep. Our April monthly report went really deep into this. And the headline here is, you said impressions. It's actually bid requests. The availability of made for advertising supply in the bid stream has fallen very dramatically, almost to the date following the release of the ANA's Programmatic Supply Chain Transparency Report last summer. And there's a lot that's behind this, but by far, driver number one is a pullback in demand. And one of the things that I don't think I realized until we started to see this decline in the availability of supply is that the MFA business model, the ad arbitrage business model, is really fragile. Like these companies have barely break-even economics. This is not a good business. You buy traffic for 5 cents. You got to work really hard to recoup that 5-cent investment. Like maybe you make, a 5%, 10%, 15% margin. What that means is even a small pullback in demand, even a few other DSPs starting to block this by default, or one big agency trying to block MFA, can break the business model, can make the arbitrage unprofitable.
Yeah, so the arbitrage is paying for traffic and then monetizing it with programmatic ads. And the paying for traffic part doesn't go down in price. So you have the cost is stable day to day, but suddenly the revenue could be quite fluctuating and is on a decline.
Exactly. And so I had it in my head, we got to get the industry to rally to sort of hold hands and say we want to block this stuff. That turned out not to be the case at all. Just a handful of buyers blocking MFA supply is enough to make that arbitrage opportunity fail. And the ad arbitrage publishers can't afford to buy as much traffic as they used to. And so just the actual availability of the supply just plummets because the arbitrage math is no longer profitable.
It's fascinating. Now, take us through the arbitrage math, because in your report, you talk about how an MFA site can break even if they show 50 ads at $1 CPM. We don't have to go through it in a lot of depth, but just take us through your thinking about how you calculated this.
Yeah, well, I mean, so here's the napkin math. You buy a click from Google search or from, the Facebook newsfeed or from Taboola or Outbrain for about 5 cents. Now you got to make back 5 cents in revenue. And so if you make a few assumptions that, the average impression is $1 CPM net revenue to the publisher, well, you have to do that 50 times to make 5 cents. And that's possible. That's a crazy advertising experience, but you can do that. And I think this really speaks to the distinction between made for advertising publishers and reputable publishers that buy traffic. I'll take some personal responsibility for this. We as an industry, I individually have sort of villainized paid traffic. And that's not the issue here. The issue is making paid traffic economics work by creating an insane user experience that sells 50 impressions in 1 to 2 minutes. And that's the business model of these made for advertising publishers.
Right. There's no expectation the user, the consumer, is ever going to come back to the site, bookmark the site, sign up for a newsletter. It's all just, you're just abusing the user as fast as possible to get your 5 cent click arbitraged up.
Right. And so one of the things we tried to address in the report more effectively than I think we've done in the past is sort of distinguishing between ad arbitrage, where you're recouping these traffic acquisition costs in 2 minutes, versus the practical reality that open internet media companies, particularly on the web, are just getting less unpaid referrals than they used to, and that paying for traffic is a business reality of running a website, but that there are healthy ways and unhealthy ways to recoup that traffic acquisition cost. And 50 impressions in a 2-minute user session is a very unhealthy way to recoup that traffic acquisition cost.
Do you have a benchmark of what is, an appropriate percentage of total traffic being paid traffic for a publisher?
I really don't. And I think it varies very substantially across media companies. There's lots of publishers, particularly sort of in the long tail, that don't buy any traffic. And there's also publishers that I think responsibly buy, very large portions of traffic. They basically find their highest RPM pages, often high RPM because of affiliate links, and they send traffic to those pages. And my view is the mix of traffic is dependence on paid traffic is only a problem if it is paired with this very user hostile advertising experience.
Yeah, we had Lara Koenig on from MIQ last week. It was great. And basically, she said 40% is their number, where, and she didn't break down the whys of that, but basically if they see a publisher with north of 40% of traffic coming from paid sources, they either cut it or have the conversation on, how to get that score down. But I think to your point, right, if it's sending it to certain high engagement areas where it's set up for commerce, I mean, that probably should be excluded.
Well, let me give you sort of like a different example there. There are publishers, you guys talked about Forbes last week. There's more that are like it. There are publishers that sprinkle in 2% paid traffic. But if they do it in a way that is like a deliberate bait and switch for buyers, my point of view is like, don't do business with that media company. Just block the whole thing. I think that's a really important perspective that creates the right incentives for publishers. Like, if you want to buy a lot of paid traffic and do it in a user first way, go for it. If you want to buy a tiny sprinkle of traffic and create a bait and switch experience, that's not the kind of company that marketers should be doing business with.
I think historically a lot of this traffic would come from SEO, but Google's now effectively a pay-to-play search engine. So you can't get your, like, here's top 10 laptops article to the top without paying.
Right. 100%. And then pushing that slightly further, not only is, receiving traffic from Google likely a paid proposition, but whether it's Google or Facebook or some of these other audience gatekeepers, they're just keeping their traffic for themselves. Like, they've built these large media businesses and they have quite a powerful ability to steer consumer attention toward YouTube or toward more time in the Facebook app or toward, in the CTV category, toward the Samsung TV Plus app. Like, these gatekeepers have a lot of leeway to either make open internet media companies in some way pay for distribution or just keep the traffic for themselves and build a high margin media business.
So let's talk about the signals. You have a comment here in your document. Publishers and their SSP partners are not rewarded for providing accurate targeting information to buyers. Instead, the sell-side financial incentive is to take a loose interpretation of industry standards and flirt with misrepresentation. Quite a statement.
Yeah, I stand by it. I think that's right. And I think if we're going to have an honest conversation about the way the internet works, like, we kind of have to acknowledge that that is the incentive. That's not to say every publisher flirts with misrepresentation. It's just that not pushing the boundaries on how to declare your video placement, or not pushing the boundaries on how to declare the floor price of an auction, or not using non-standard, lower integrity ways to populate the buyer user ID is a business choice that leaves money on the table. And a lot of publishers make that choice with some vague notion of playing the long game. But the short-term financial incentive is very much to sort of stretch the truth. Now, I don't think you want to stretch it as a publisher so far that you're fundamentally misrepresenting inventory. Like, you can't totally spoof the information in the bid request. You will be caught. You will be flagged as fraudulent. You'll be blown out of the industry. But you can stretch the truth a little bit in a way that you could plausibly defend as being accurate, and you'll make more money. And a lot of publishers do that.
So that ties into signals and ID bridging. So you make a analysis of, by browser, what you call the ID alignment rate. And your point is the ID alignment rate in Chrome is very high. It's in the 90s, but on Safari browsers, it's just 31%. So what is an ID alignment rate?
Yeah, I mean, this is extremely early. I think this is one of those things we'll look back in 2 or 3 years and be like, oh, that was such early thinking. But the early thinking is basically, if a DSP receives a bid request that says, oh, here's an opportunity to buy cookie 123. When you buy the impression and you have some client server connection, you should be able to validate that this browser locally does store a cookie in your domain space that says it's user 123. And as you said, in Chrome, that happens high 90s% of the time. And so that's what we call the alignment rate. How often does the ID in the request match the ID stored in the browser? And in Safari, it's low. More importantly, I think in Safari, the dispersion across publishers is huge. That there are some publishers where the alignment rate is pretty close to perfect, because those are kind of like naive publishers that are doing the legacy cookie sync process that overwhelmingly fails in Safari. But that when a bid request, or a small number of users who've configured Safari to allow third-party cookies, when a bid request declares a cookie ID, the DSP finds that cookie ID in the browser. But you find other publishers where high 90s% of the time that the bid request declares a user ID, there's just no ID set in the user's browser at all. And that's not necessarily to say that was bad targeting information provided in the request, but it is very clearly an indication that the publisher has in some way injected an ID into this bid request that was not the result of like the classic expected cookie matching process.
So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The rate is just an indicator about what's going on.
You're right. It is not necessarily a bad thing. I do think the sell side needs to take some accountability for doing this for years and not telling the buy side about it. But there are for sure high integrity ways to populate these signals, these sort of like non-standard matching methods. And there's also low integrity ways to do it. And the problem is nobody knows what's what. It's really hard to figure out whether the ID being passed in a bid request is reliable or not. And so there's a lot of work ahead. And the IB Tech Lab is doing all the right things here. There's a lot of work ahead to sort of like arm the buy side with better information about essentially the provenance of this ID. Like, how did this thing get populated? Was this the result of a classic cookie sync? Was this populated using some kind of recovery technique, a bridging technique? How did this value get generated so that the buy side can make decisions about which requests essentially to trust and which ones not to trust?
So I want to bring up the last topic that I know you wanted to talk about. So, and you have quite a large section of your report on this, what you call bid stream congestion. And so I think I'll do my best to explain this, which is the average ads.txt file has over 450 authorized supply paths, tripling since 2020. Those are your words. But what's going on here is there's so much QPS that bidders, DSPs, can't listen to it all. You come up with this phrase, which I think we should have on a t-shirt, which is feed DSPs what they eat, which effectively means that the SSPs end up causing bias in the bid stream because they send them more and more QPS that they know the DSP is going to buy, and that may not be reflective of what the advertisers actually want. What do you find on this subject?
I mean, I think you captured it very well. Just to play it out a couple of steps further, there is no longer any DSP that listens to the entire bid stream. Even DV360 now puts caps on how many requests its SSP partners can send it. And so that means that each DSP is seeing some subset of available supply. And Ari, as you said, the subset that each DSP sees, the subset that each SSP chooses to send to each DSP is designed to match what that DSP historically buys. That's the, feed DSPs what they eat bit. And so if a DSP demonstrates a lot of demand for app inventory, it's going to disproportionately see bid requests for apps and disproportionately not see requests for websites. And so to the extent you are a mobile app advertiser, it's like really important to work with a DSP whose other customers mostly buy mobile app supply. Because if you work with a DSP that mostly buys web supply, you're not going to have access to the supply that you want. I think that's pretty reasonable. But that extends to every aspect of the bid stream. If you as a buyer don't want to buy made for advertising supply, you really don't want to be working with the DSP whose other customers buy a lot of MFA supply because the bid stream is going to be clogged with lots of MFA requests. Similarly, if you're a publisher, if you're a premium publisher, it's going to be hard. It's going to be harder to sell your inventory to a buyer in a DSP where 1 out of every 4 requests leads to a made for advertising auction. And you're going to have much more success selling to a buyer who buys through a platform like the Trade Desk, where a very small portion of bid requests lead to MFA supply because they don't buy it. It's one of these things that I've been thinking about for a long time, but what we included in the report was some data that we finally got our hands on that sort of quantifies like how different the composition is of the bid stream through the top 10 DSPs. It's one of these things where like, I thought this was a big deal and it's a way bigger deal than I thought. And so, what I had said to you, Ari, when we were talking about this podcast is like, I don't know, this is the most important thing in the industry, but it's the most underappreciated thing in the industry.
Right. Because often buyers think DSPs are all the same and they evaluate them based on, some feature or some new shiny toy that a DSP may have released. But actually, there may be pretty significantly different patterns of supply in the different DSPs.
There's extremely different patterns of supply. And so, our recommendation for DSPs here is either you need to find a way to be the Trade Desk or DV360 and listen to tens of millions of requests per second. Well, that's not going to happen for most DSPs. Or you need to think hard about whether it makes sense to be listening to requests from 30 SSPs. Like if the average DSP operates at 3 million QPS and takes 100,000 QPS from 30 SSPs, that's a lot of skinny pipes that are going to give you like these weird cross sections of supply. And it would be much, much better to fire 25 of those SSPs and listen to take a fat pipe from 5 SSPs. And I don't think any DSP is going to do that. They're not going to fire their SSP partners. But I think what's very much on the table is very aggressive QPS allocations, where you could choose 2 to 5 SSPs and say, give me 500,000 QPS, and then take the rest and say, I'll only take 10,000 QPS from you.
Fascinating. So I think we're going to have to call it on that. This was an amazing discussion. State of the Open Internet from Jounce Media. We're going to take a break, and we'll come back with news of the week and then the people on the street interviews. This podcast is brought to you by Innovid and their Harmony initiative. Innovid believes that TV should be open for everyone and controlled by no one. And the time to make that vision a reality is now. That's why Innovid created Harmony, an industry-wide initiative to address the biggest challenges facing CTV advertising today. By optimizing at the infrastructure level, Harmony aims to improve efficiency, enhance transparency and control, and increase ROI, all while reducing carbon emissions and providing better viewing experiences for all. Find out more and get involved at innovid.com/harmony.
And we're back. We'll keep this quick and punchy, hit a couple of important news items before we end this with some fun person on the street interviews. So 3 things here from this week. So the first is more MFA news. So great to have Chris to talk about this. Brian O'Kelly from Scope 3 had a post on LinkedIn earlier this week that said 14% of ad placements load off screen or auto refresh in fewer than 15 seconds. These quote unquote problematic placements, effectively made for advertising placements, are now a bigger problem than MFA websites. So that's sort of thing one. So we've got non-viewable, sort of like in view of the screen things that are out there that are auto refreshing and burning through ads. So that's number one. And then number two, maybe this is interesting, that there's very little overlap between MFA sites, right? So the ones that Chris was talking about being effectively eliminated from the bid stream, and these problematic placements. So it seems like the problem puck has moved from MFA sites to problematic placements. And he didn't say it, but it sounds like it's like on premium sites or sites that are making it through the MFA filters. So, Chris, how do we think about this?
Well, I think, the problem puck is that's a good turn of phrase. I'm really glad that Brian did not call this MFA. I think it's really important to ring fence that, like, MFA is an ad arbitrage business model, and we need to clearly separate that from other quality issues. But yeah, he's absolutely right that we call this cheap reach, these sort of like chronically non-viewable or low attention ad products. And you also are right, Eric, that the place where these placements exist is on premium publishers. It's the below the fold stuff. So Brian's absolutely right, and I think the industry should be putting some pressure on publishers to either stop monetizing these placements or monetize them in a much more advertiser friendly way. I should also highlight that's happening. We work with a lot of these publishers and these intermediaries, and like there are levers that these intermediaries can pull to just like fix it. It's like, oh, you say you have a viewability problem. It's like, boop, boop, boop. Like all of a sudden it goes from 5% viewability to 50% viewability. And, a little bit of pressure will help. My only concern with this whole thing is, as an industry, we keep attacking publishers, and they sometimes deserve that. But I think everybody's kind of tired of talking about all the bad things that happen on the open internet. I know I am. And so what I'm hoping happens is that we kind of do the same work, but reframe it as not this is bad and that's bad and here's this other problem, but like here's the very best of the open internet. Like the basic incentive for the sell side of the market is still to make the maximum volume of impressions that barely meet buyer standards. That's an issue. There's no incentive right now, as far as I can tell, to make outstanding high quality ad products. And I'm hopeful that, Scope 3 and our work and others can kind of refocus the spotlight on like, hey, here's the top 10 to 20% very best of the open internet. And buyers should be spending more of their money there. This supply is radically higher quality and only a little bit more expensive. And if that happened, and if buyers started to focus more on like concentrating investments on the very best supply, that's not just good for buyers, that creates better incentives for the internet.
True. But like these placements are oftentimes used to game the system when it comes to attribution, right? So like, still last cookie wins, right? The view-based attribution stuff, right? So
in that way, it's somewhat similar to MFA. Right. It's like the metrics are guiding you to make the wrong decisions. Like in the case of MFA, it was like, oh, I want high viewability. It's like, well, do you really? Because here's where high viewability is. And, this is sort of like, well, I want last touch attribution. Like, well, do you really? Because you wind up buying a lot of non-viewable ad products. So you're right. You're absolutely right.
All right. Any thoughts on this?
I'd actually have a follow-up question for Chris, which is, what do you think of the well-rumored S&P 500 from Trade Desk?
I don't have any visibility into how that all works, and I'm trying to learn more. So I can't speak to any of the details. But yeah, I think it's like philosophically in line with what I was describing, that it isn't, I think like the spirit of it is, how do we identify the very best of the open internet and make it very easy for buyers to sort of like preferentially access that supply?
Makes sense. All right, moving on. Big executive news. So Krishan Bhatia, who was formerly an executive at NBCU with like big revenue responsibility, has a new role, and it's a newly created role, as I understand it, at Amazon. So Krishan is going to be heading up Amazon Ads as Vice President of Global Video Strategy. He will lead a global sales team focused on streaming TV offerings across live sports, Amazon Freevee, Twitch, Prime Video ads, and third-party publishers. So just another signal that Amazon is taking this streaming and TV thing super seriously and bringing on probably one of the best in the biz. So congrats to Krishan, and again, big signal on Amazon.
Yeah, and you could see my interview with him when he was at NBC on Architecture TV.
Absolutely. All right. Last thing. We'll. I don't even know where to start. So there was some drama on X, and it involved Check My Ads, it involved Double Verify, and it involved Elon. So, Ari, you want to walk us through this?
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to lay this out. Okay. To start, we have a friend of the pod, Nandini from Check My Ads, who claims personal responsibility for getting X decertified with TAG, which is one of the industry certification groups. She sent them a complaint saying X was no longer brand safe like a year ago, and just a couple weeks ago, they lost their certification. So she's running a little victory lap. Good for you. All right. That's not the interesting part. So the interesting part is on Friday, Elon Musk tweeted about our industry, which is always disturbing. It's like you just don't want him involved. But he tweeted about Double Verify, pretty aggressively claiming that they had made mistakes, and they admitted their mistakes, and then the X business account also tweeted about how Double Verify. Here's a quote from the X business account. Double Verify, a company responsible for providing brand safety measurements to major advertisers, has been displaying an erroneous graphical error of X's brand safety rate on their user interface for over 4.5 months. As a result, they displayed extremely misleading brand safety scores. Long story short. And then Double Verify put out a note as well. So this is not fake news. Double Verify put out a note saying that basically the graph on their dashboard was wrong about X's supposed brand safety measures, and it exceeded 99.99% from October 2023 to the present. So reading into the subcontext here, first of all, no one wants to put out a note saying their measurements are wrong. Secondly, this came out at 7 p.m. on a Friday. So I really don't think Double Verify wanted to put this out, but there. You can read between the lines. There was some arm twisting that happened here. There might have been a quick phone call from Linda to someone at Double Verify. There might have been a little screaming at X headquarters. There might have been a lot of drama. We'd love to hear the play-by-play, but we don't have it. And that was, as much drama as I could take for a Friday evening. But then people started looking and saying 99.99% safe, brand safe. That doesn't really comport with my experience of using X on a regular basis. And then, as if summoned from the mountain, on Tuesday, NBC News put out a report finding that at least 150 premium subscribers on X had posted or amplified pro-Nazi content, and that ads were running on 74 of those 150 premium accounts, either on their profile pages or in the replies below their posts. So I think this isn't a direct attack at that 99.99% number of Double Verify, because obviously there's methodology issues. The ads need to appear directly next to the Nazi content or the pornographic content in order to not qualify for Double Verify. But I think the consensus in the world of advertising is that there's some BS here. There's no way that anyone would think that X is that highly consistently safe. And the NBC News information seems to also point to that direction. I don't know if there's going to be another shoe to drop. I think at some point, this is kind of a useless debate. I think if a brand wants to be on X, they can, and they should know what they're getting. And it's a mixed bag of some great stuff and some terrible stuff. And you should use these vendors to try to avoid the bad stuff. But 99.99% seems like a bit of an exaggeration. And another way to look at it is that 1 out of every 1,000 of your ads is going to be next to Nazi content. So that's my general overview of the situation. So we're going to close on that. We're going to take a quick break, go back with people on the street interviews. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is always fun.
Hey, everybody. It's Eric. I'm here with Jonah Goodhart, former CEO of Moat, now CEO of Mobian. Jonah, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the show, Eric.
You're welcome. So what's the most exciting, interesting, or neat thing that you've seen so far in Possible or generally in ad tech right now in 2024?
Well, I guess I can't go 10 seconds without talking about AI. And so I think the quote from Sundar Pichai from Google was, AI will affect every product in every company. And I think that's absolutely coming true here in the world of advertising. And so it's really fun to see how creative companies and outcome companies and everything from bidding platforms to measurement systems are reimagining their businesses and capabilities, leveraging some of the latest and greatest in AI.
Amazing. Thank you. What are you excited for the next couple of days?
Really catching up with folks. I mean, this event, it has gone blown away expectations. I think there's 3,400 people here, something in that order of magnitude, something like a quarter plus brands. So pretty strong presence at a historically very heavy ad tech foundation. So really excited to get out there, talk to folks, see what people are hearing, see what people are doing. And I think industry is about people in the end of the day. So yes, we build technology, and of course that's about AI at this point. But in the end of the day, humans are the people that use all these tools. And so I'm always excited to get out there and chat with the people behind all of the great stuff happening in our world.
Thank you, Jonah. Always a pleasure. I'm back with Greg Williams, president at Audigent. Big fan of Greg and his Man on the Street interviews and previous podcasts. Greg, thank you for joining us today. What is interesting, exciting in ad tech? What are you seeing Possible? What's on your mind?
I think the most interesting thing, the biggest thing that folks are talking about right now is the privacy sandbox and Google and this concept of how do you exchange data back and forth through protected audiences. And there's a lot of discussion about it. There's a lot of discussion mostly about what does the industry, what does the ecosystem need to do to prepare for that. And everybody has a role, from the publisher to the supply side tech partners to demand side tech partners to data providers. And everybody's got to play that role and start doing their part to get ready and to test. And I can't emphasize enough, everybody's got to play their part to be able to test and to drive scale through this environment. Beyond that, I think just the general approach of in the feel of there's really like this exuberance around new technologies that are emerging as a result of all this change that we're undergoing, from the privacy landscape all the way through to browser changes and everything else. So
amazing, Greg. Thank you so much, as always. I'm back with friend of the pod, Joe Zappa. Joe, this is your first Possible. I'm glad you're down here. What do you think? What's your impression?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Two things here. So one thing is that people will say, oh, well, is it worth going to Possible? Like, it's just a bunch of ad tech companies. And that's true. There aren't a ton of brands here. But I think like success in ad tech is partially determined by hype and awareness and building buzz. And that is a big part of what being down here and having conversations with influencers is about. It's not just about like the people who directly see you here. It's about doing an activation like Ad Tech God doing, I think they did like an activation in taxis, and then, Paul Gubbins putting it on his LinkedIn, and then like hundreds or thousands of people are looking at it. So that's one thing, is that hype matters, and going to events and doing marketing is part of that. Another interesting takeaway I had from a conversation with Warren Zenna about marketing orgs is that marketing is generally driven by two different kinds of leaders. You have like the big picture storyteller type of person, and then you have an ops person who is like figuring stuff out with sales and product and like working through Salesforce and making sure you're actually generating value. And those two people are generally very different, and you're not going to get those two skill sets in one. So that's just a marketing lesson I took away from conversations here.
Super cool. Thank you, Joe. I'm back with Steve Wolf-Pereira, EVP and Chief Client Officer at Televisa Univision. Did I say that right?
Again, very good.
Excellent. Steve, what are you excited about these days? What are you enjoying at Possible?
Well, Eric, we're at Possible, and what am I excited about? It's finally the death of the cookie. It's been 10 years coming, but it's finally here, and now you start to see people really move to contextual advertising, and context is just another way of saying culture. And so when you really think about how are you going to authentically connect with a consumer, it has to be in culture. And that is really opening up this whole can of worms around first-party data again, because folks need to connect in an authentic way. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface on what retail media could really be. So I'm really excited about retail media.
Amazing. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.